Today, we're going to explore another highly underrated chess opening known as the Grob Attack, which begins with the move pawn to g4. At first glance, this might look like a beginner's mistake, since it weakens white's kingside. However, I've played it myself in blitz games, checked the statistics, and, surprisingly, this unusual opening often brings great results. I decided to break down why it works and share my insights with you. So, what's the purpose of pawn to g4, and why should you consider playing it? First, it immediately takes your opponent out of their opening preparation, since it's a very rare move. Second, it prepares a fianchetto. You'll place your bishop on g2, creating long-term pressure along the long diagonal. Also, the pawn on g4 can be annoying for black's knight, since the knight often comes to f6 early in the game. In this position, if they do that, you can kick it away by advancing pawn to g5. I'm not showing a specific opening variation right now, just explaining the main ideas behind the move. So, there are two main ideas behind the Grob Attack. First, you place your bishop on g2, where it becomes extremely active and can cause serious problems for black. Second, you can kick black's knight away from f6 by advancing the pawn forward. These are the general strategic points. Now let's get down to the actual moves and see some concrete lines. This opening is surprisingly tricky, and there are many ways for black to quickly get into trouble. Interestingly, one of the most common responses from black is pawn to d5. I can't really say why so many players choose this instead of pawn to e5, which is also a perfectly good move, but they often go for pawn to d5, possibly because they want to attack the g4 pawn right away. However, this direct approach doesn't work that well for black. In fact, you can, and should, sacrifice the pawn. Some players try to defend it with pawn to h3, but that's far too passive. You're not playing the Grob Attack and its gambit ideas just to defend quietly, you want to go for activity. The best move here is to continue with bishop to g2, offering the g4 pawn as bait. The idea is simple. You want black to capture the g4 pawn so they walk right into trouble. What kind of trouble? Well, if they take the g4 pawn, you immediately respond with pawn to c4. Suddenly, you're attacking black right from the very first moves of the game. The bishop on g2 is now targeting the pawn on d5, and at the same time, it's also eyeing the pawn on b7. That b7 pawn is no longer defended because the bishop that normally sits on c8 is absent, and as a result, black is already in a difficult position. From my database checks, I've noticed that most players, when faced with this, have no idea how to react. They often make poor moves and quickly fall into worse positions. One common mistake is that black greedily takes a second pawn by capturing on c4, assuming you're just a reckless player throwing pawns away. But now, you can capture the pawn on b7, and not only do you win material, but the rook on a8 is also trapped and will be taken soon. While this exact line isn't extremely popular, it does happen, and when it does, it's usually a disaster for black. Let's take a closer look at this critical position in the Grob Attack and examine the different common ways black might respond. As I mentioned earlier, black often reacts poorly here. That's not entirely surprising. First, most players are unfamiliar with this line, and second, defending in chess is generally more difficult than attacking. So when faced with this unusual setup, it's easy for black to go wrong. One common way black tries to defend the pawn on d5 is by playing pawn to e6. At first, this makes sense. It supports the center and keeps the pawn safe. Here, you should play the very thematic move queen to b3. This move works in the vast majority of lines in this opening because the queen on b3 works perfectly with the bishop on g2. Together, they apply strong pressure to the critical squares d5 and b7. From b3, the queen attacks along the diagonal b3 to f7, hitting both the d5 and b7 pawns at the same time. This constant pressure forces black to make a decision. Usually, your opponent will notice that queen to b3 is targeting the b7 pawn, so they push it forward with pawn to b6. This is actually a very popular response, but it's completely wrong. It weakens the long diagonal, which is one of the main attacking routes for white in the Grob Attack. After this, you simply play pawn takes d5, and when black recaptures, you take the pawn with your bishop, keeping the pressure high and activating your pieces even further. Once black realizes that your bishop is attacking the rook on a8, they often try to defend by playing pawn to c6. However, the bishop on d5 is not only attacking the rook, it's also attacking along the other diagonal with support from your queen on b3. This means you can, and should, capture the pawn on f7 with check. After the king moves, you happily take another piece, the knight on g8. At this point, black's position is completely ruined. You've won a piece and a pawn, the king is exposed, and you can easily bring your queen into the attack, for example with queen to f7 on the next move. Realistically, it's already time for black to resign. Another possible defense for black in the critical position of the Grob Attack, after you've played pawn to c4 to undermine the center, is bishop to c5 e6. This is an awkward-looking move because it blocks the e-pawn and prevents their other bishop from developing. Still, many black players choose it, hoping you'll trade in the center. If you capture on d5 and allow them to recapture with the bishop, their position immediately improves as that bishop becomes very strong and well-placed. If you allow the exchange in the center, black's fianchetto bishop will be neutralized, and you'll be left with nothing to compensate for the sacrificed pawn. That's exactly what your opponent is hoping for, but we're not going to give it to them. Instead of trading in the center on the previous move, you should play the same thematic move queen to b3. As always, this puts pressure on both the b7 pawn and the central d5 pawn, creating a dilemma for black, because they cannot defend both at the same time. In most cases, black tries pawn to b6 to protect b7. That's when you capture on d5, attacking the bishop and gaining an important tempo. The bishop must move, and now you can continue developing naturally with knight to f3. After knight to f6, you can increase the pressure immediately with knight to e5. The point is that for black to develop properly, they would need to advance some of their pawns, but your pieces, especially the knight on a5 combined with the bishop on g2, control so many critical squares that black can barely move. You're dominating the position completely, with your pieces already active while black is still struggling to get their forces out. Now let's look at one of black's strongest responses, pawn to c6. This is not only one of the best moves for black, but also the most common. Here, you have a choice between two good options. One is more solid, while the other is a bit trickier and aggressive. You can choose whichever best suits your style. The solid option, one straightforward approach, is to play queen to b3 right away, immediately targeting the b7 pawn and putting pressure on black's position. However, the drawback is that black can respond with the symmetrical queen to b6, offering a trade of queens. This usually leads to a calm, simplified game. You'll still pick up the pawn on d5, but with the queens exchanged, the position drifts into an equal endgame. For the Grob Attack, often considered risky, that's still a respectable result, though not particularly dynamic. The trickier option, if you'd rather keep the tension and aim for sharper play, skip the immediate queen to b3. Instead, start by capturing the pawn on d5. Only after black recaptures do you place your queen on b3, keeping more pieces on the board and setting up tactical chances. This move order prevents black from easily forcing a queen trade and leaves you with more attacking possibilities. After black recaptures, you place your queen on b3, keeping the pressure alive. In many games, opponents instinctively defend the b7 pawn with pawn to a6, but this move walks straight into your hidden tactic, queen to a forecheck. This clever move delivers a double attack on the king and the bishop, forcing you to win the bishop outright. It's a clean, tactical blow that can tilt the game heavily in your favor, often leading to a swift and decisive victory.